All right, that sounds wonderful. That's great. And I'm looking forward to the defense next year. So this is very good. And Nathaniel's doctoral dissertation director is Professor Twetton, who is on sabbatical this year, but I'm also on the team. And Nathaniel is presenting at the American Catholic Louis as well. And if anyone has a job handy that you'd like Nathaniel to consider, he's going to be available next year. So, and we've had good luck of late, and we'd like to continue the streak. So, Nathaniel, let you know your title and your life.
All right. Dr. Taylor, thank you so much.
Nathaniel, if you want to send me a handout, I'll find a way to put it on for you.
Very good. I will do just that. All right. Please give me just one moment, everyone. Thank you so much. Let's see. There we go. That should do it. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to present some of this research to you all. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. I don't know if you heard in our chatting before this presentation, but I recently my first son was born, so we might hear some comments from him at any point. I'm afraid I've not taught him to not interrupt yet. We're still working on it, but so if you hear any of that sound, I'm sure he's got some harsh criticism for me. All right, so today I'm presenting some research, some of the bigger conclusions that I found in my dissertation. I'm eager to present this to you and to hear some of your comments. Today I'm presenting on the categories, essence, and modi essendi, Avicenna at the heart of Aquinas's metaphysics. And so I'll just begin. So I want to begin this presentation with a quotation from Etienne Gilson, an old quotation. In Being and Some Philosophers, Gilson writes, quote, "For those who identify what Thomas calls being with what is commonly called substance, there can be no distinction between essence and existence, since being and ousia are one and the same thing. Each time Thomas Aquinas himself is looking at being as at a substance, he thereby reoccupies the position of Aristotle, and it is no wonder that in such cases, the distinction between essence and existence does not occur to his own mind." Now, this is certainly an old opinion, and one about which Gilson very well may have changed his mind. In his 1974 study, Quasi Definitio Substantiae, Gilson discusses his surprising discovery that Aquinas consistently avails himself of an Avicennian definition of substance, not reoccupying the position of Aristotle, as he said earlier. Now there, Gilson tells us that, quote, "The key to the problem of the true definition of substance is the celebrated distinction of essence and esse, being, in finite beings." Thus, in 1974, in a decisive move away from his earlier statement, we have Gilson suggesting that Avicenna's real distinction between essence and esse, in fact, underlies Thomas's understanding of substance. Now, I think the view that Thomas does not simply reoccupy the position of Aristotle when it comes to substance and adopts an Avicennian quasi-definition of substance is fairly solidified and uncontested at this point in the secondary literature, perhaps though with the exception of Leo Elders in 1993. Gilson clarified the matter a great deal himself in the aforementioned 1974 study, and along with J.G. Flynn discussing the Avicennian definition of substance in 2 studies from the same year. Thomas's Avicennian quasi-definition of substance was discussed by Whipple, famously in his Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas in 2000. And just how deep the import of this definition of substance goes is still being plumbed in more recent literature, notably by Gregory Doolin in 2011. Now, all that being said, I want to focus on the last thing that Gilson says in that quotation we started off with. He said that each time Thomas Aquinas himself is looking at being as at a substance, the distinction between essence and existence does not occur to his mind. Gilson here suggests that an Aristotelian consideration of substance does not lead the mind to discover or even consider a real distinction between the essence of the substance and its actuality. This seems plausible, but I'm going to argue this does not seem like Thomas Aquinas. If Thomas adopts an Avicennian consideration of substance and not an Aristotelian consideration, then it is possible that the consideration of substance might be the occasion on which one might discover the real distinction. Now, this, of course, seems plausible for those who are familiar with Thomas's so-called genus argument. But this argument has been widely considered insufficient or a kind of downright blunder for arguing for any real distinction between essence and existence. This is why I think most commentators think that there's no serious consideration of substance that could lead the mind to discover the real distinction. So in this presentation, I want to articulate what it is that Aquinas learned from Avicenna about substance, such that the consideration of substance might lead one to discover a real distinction between essence and existence. My goal is not simply to hash out and defend the genus argument, though some of that is going to be done here. Rather, my goal is to lay out the conceptual framework that makes something like the genus argument a live and compelling option. This framework is comprised of 3 doctrines concerning how being in its many senses relates to the categories. So I'm going to outline these 3 doctrines, show where we can find them in Avicenna and Aquinas, and finally discuss some of the motivations and the implications of these doctrines. All right, so let's start with this first doctrine that I think leads us to, by considering substance, discover a real distinction. This first doctrine is that the categories, Aristotle's categories, are categories of essences, even the accidental categories. By this, I mean to say that in each of the categories are sorted various discrete, intelligible patterns in nature. This seems to be the intention of Aristotle in distinguishing accidental beings from kathauto beings, which include all of the 10 categories, in his Metaphysics Delta 7. Per se, or kathauto beings, are those things which are what they are by virtue of themselves, and they are so in a manner which exhibits a kind of intelligible unity and pattern that are not found in per accidens beings. Per se beings are those things which do not just so happen to be what they are. Even accidents, like white or 3 cubit long, are what they are by virtue of themselves alone. Even though they require a substance in which to inhere, it is false to say that, for example, white is a color because of the substance in which white inheres. Rather, white is what it is because of itself. There is no further answer we could give to the question, why is white a color? That's what it is. And so that's what Aristotle's getting at with this division of per se, kathauto being. It is what it is by virtue of itself. Now, that even the accidental categories are per se beings and therefore have an essence, this becomes a standard point of commentary for the later commentators on Aristotle. Eudorus, Dexippus, and Simplicius all admonish Andronicus of Rhodes for reducing all of the accidental categories to what he called relative beings or proste beings. The error, according to Dexippus and Simplicius and Eudorus, is to reduce the accident to its subject. Dexippus writes that when we refer an accident to its subject, it is something relative. In this sense, Andronicus gets this right. But Dexippus writes, in and of itself, the accident is some proper nature. He says, kathauto tos sumbebikos fusis tis idea. And before you tell me that these authors are motivated to make such a claim because they're all Platonists, I would like to direct you to the commentary of Alexander of Aphrodisias on Metaphysics Delta 7. Commenting on Aristotle's claim that, quote, for however many figures of predication there are, in so many ways is being said, Alexander explains that this is so because being, or the copula is, takes its meaning from, quote, the nature with which it is stationed. Thus, to be human signifies one sense of being, and to be a color, to be white, for example, signifies a different sense of being, because being takes its character from the nature that the term with which it is placed signifies. In giving this account, even Alexander is committed to there being natures or essences in the accidental categories, namely distinctive to be's. I mention this to establish the point that this doctrine is not unique to Avicenna or Aquinas because it makes up the intellectual context in which both Avicenna and Aquinas find themselves. So by the time this idea reaches Avicenna, Avicenna has no qualms about stating the matter at hand frankly in his commentary on the categories. There, Avicenna tells us, quote, the categories are categories of essences. Wa al-maqulat hiya maqulat dhawat. Moreover, Avicenna follows Metaphysics Delta 7 in his own characterization of per se being. And now if you have the text at hand, this is going to be text 1. Avicenna writes, and we say, the being of a thing is per se, for example, the being of a human qua human, or accidental, for example, the being of Zaid qua white. And the things which are accidental are unlimited. But now let us leave behind this topic, the unlimited accidental being, and take up the topic of being and the being which is through itself, per se, or bildet. Now the most prior division of beings through themselves is substance. And this is because being through itself is divided into two divisions. The first of the two is the being in another thing, and the other thing in which it is a thing having achieved subsistence and species in itself. Now, again, to the accident, being not like being a part of it, without the possibility that one permits its separation from the being, and this is the being in a subject. And the second division of being is the being without that it is one of the things, without that it is in one of the things in its description, such that it is not in a subject at all, and this is substance. Here, Avicenna tells us that being is first of all divided into accidental being and being through itself or being through its essence, that. Since accidental being is that part of being which exhibits no intelligible pattern, it is not able to be the subject of a scientific investigation. And so for this reason, Avicenna moves quickly to being through its essence, which he tells us is divided into two sorts. The beings which are in a subject and those that are not in a subject. This is an important detail because it establishes for us the same view of the categories that we get in Aristotle's Metaphysics Delta 7, namely that being kathauto includes all of the categories. Thus, the category of substance and the accidental categories share in that they are per se beings. They share in that they are things having essences, but they are distinguished according as things in the category of substance are not in a subject, and things in the accidental categories are in a subject. Avicenna confirms this in his commentary on the categories. This is your text 2 if you're looking at the handout. The substance is a being not requiring in its being some other being, and the accident is a being requiring in its being this, namely another being. And so both of these things share in something, and it is the expression being. And thereupon, after this, there is a difference in that it is either through itself or not, and either in need of another or not in need. This structure of that which is common to the categories and that which distinguishes the categories is reminiscent of a kind of genus differentia structure of a definition. And indeed, there's some evidence to think that Avicenna thought of things this way. When Avicenna discusses the definition of substance, he insists across many texts that substance should be defined, so to speak, as a thing having an essence which exists not in a subject. This is our text 3. Someone may say, you have avoided assigning to the first the name substance, but you do not avoid assigning to him its meaning. This is because he is a being not in a subject, and this meaning is the substance, which is his genus. We answer, this is not the meaning of substance, which is a genus. Rather, the meaning of a substance as a genus is a thing having a determinate essence which exists not in a subject, such as a body or a soul. A thing having a determinate essence serves as the kind of quasi-genus term because it is common to the category of substance and to the categories of accidents. And being not in a subject serves as a quasi-differentia term because it serves to distinguish the category of substance from the other 9 categories of accidents. And now we find this same structure of something common and something distinguishing in the categories in Aquinas, notably when he cites Avicenna's quasi-definition of substance. We see this across the texts in which Thomas discusses the Avicennian definition of substance, but nowhere so clearly as in the Summa, where Thomas writes the following. This is text 4 in your handout. To the second, it must be said that since being is not a genus, this very what it is to be is not able to be an essence or substance or accident. Therefore, the definition of substance is not a being through itself without a subject, nor is the definition of an accident a being in a subject, but rather it agrees with the quiddity or essence of a substance to have being not in a subject, and it agrees with the quiddity or essence of an accident to have a being in a subject. Here, we can see that Thomas is also committed to the view that essence is to be found in all of the categories, not just the category of substance. It's interesting to note that this doctrine is not found exclusively in texts citing Avicenna or Avicennian doctrine. In fact, I have found the same doctrine in another text that deals with substance more generally, and in a text influenced by Boethius. This is an early text from the Sentences commentary, where Thomas tells us that to be is a certain common thing, and it does not designate some mode of being. But to subsist does convey a determined mode of being, according as something is a being through itself. And that from this, it is clear that to be conveys that which is common to all of the categories, but to subsist and to substand is that which is proper to the first category as 2 things which belong to it, namely that which is a being complete in itself, and again, that which underlies all other accidents which have being in a substance. So this is Sentences 1, distinction 23, question 1, article 1. Later in this same text, Thomas says that essence signifies that whose act it is to be. Thus, it is being in the sense of essence that is common to all of the categories, and what distinguishes the category of substance from the other accidental categories is the mode of being per se, or being not in a subject for Thomas Aquinas. So let's move on to the second doctrine that kind of motivates Aquinas looking at substance and seeing there a real distinction. The second doctrine is that to be in a category is to be something composed of an essence and a constitutive property which follows from that essence, namely to be not in a subject, or to be per se, as Thomas will say, or to be in a subject for accidents. Now, before we dive into this doctrine, I want to clear the air before any miasma of ambiguity steeps in. Previously, we are discussing the division of the senses of being, one of which is per se being. We find there that per se being means essence. Now, in this section, we're going to discuss being not in a subject as like a property of substance. And I want to warn you all that Thomas more often uses the phrase being per se as equivalent to being not in a subject. And so we have to remember that there are 2 senses of being per se, and they're distinct. The sense of being per se that we're going to be interested in this section does not signify essence, and it is not distinguished from per accidens being. Rather, the sense of being per se that is a kind of concomitant of essence for Thomas signifies being not in a subject, and it's distinguished from being in a subject. So the opposite of this sense that we're focusing on here is not per accidens being, but being in a subject. So I hope with that a bit more clear, let's proceed. And I'll apologize for Thomas's kind of confusing choice of language here. So this second doctrine is also a continuation of the commentary tradition. In Book 5 of his Categories, Aristotle discusses several defining features of substance, including being not in a subject, being receptive of contraries, underlying changes, etc. The commentary tradition took this book to be outlining properties, idea, or concomitants, at times they said. We find this language in Ammonius, perikoluthemata, concomitants, or completers is another term they use, sumplerotica. We find that especially in the commentaries of Porphyry, in the work of Plotinus, and picked up in Simplicius. Now, this commentary tradition is undoubtedly one of the reasons that we use the phrase being per se as like a definition for substance. For we often use proper accidents, idea, to define and to distinguish things. And this is precisely what we see the commentators do. Notably, Simplicius, who says that to be through itself is a completer, a sumplerodikon of substance. Now, all of these terms aim to signify that being through itself, or being not in a subject, is a constitutive property of a substance. It is a property that is attendant upon and follows from the essence of the substance, and it's constitutive. It makes the substance to be a substance. Now, there's evidence that both Avicenna and Aquinas are continuing this tradition, though here there's a notable distinction. They do so in notably different ways. We find Avicenna calling being not in a subject a constitutive of substance in his commentary on the Categories. This is text 5 if you're following the handout. Avicenna writes, when you consider some person like Zaid when he's absent from you, or when you consider a species of substance with the ability to disappear from the world, if it could disappear from you, or a species whose existence one doubts, then you know that its essence, when it is in an individual, is not in a subject. One knows that this notion, namely not being in a subject, is the primary constituent of its essence, and one knows that it is a complete substance. But one does not know whether it is a being not in a subject in individuals in actuality. Rather, perhaps it's non-existent. Indeed, being an act in an individual not in a subject is not a constituent for the essence of Zaid or for some substance. Rather, this is something that attaches, an attachment of being, which is not true for the essence of the things, as you have learned. Here's a text where we get that famous claim of Avicenna that existence, being in actuality, is like an attachment, is something accidental to the essence. Now, note well that Avicenna here tells us that being not in a subject is the primary constituent, al-muqawim al-ulla, of a substance's essence. That is, it makes the substance a substance. And that when the essence is instantiated in an individual case, the substance is not in a subject, and thus the substance is a complete substance. This language of being not in a subject constituting and completing a substance is very similar to the commentators. Completing, the fulfilling, this is kind of Simplician language. Now, to my knowledge, Thomas does not describe being per se or being not in a subject as a constitutive of substance like we see Avicenna do here. Rather, Thomas prefers to call these phrases modes of being, as we've already seen above. He does so famously in his De Veritate, and this is text 6 on your handout. But things are not able to be added to being like external things in the manner by which a difference is added to a genus or accidents added to a subject, because each nature is essentially a being. Hence, the philosopher proves in the Metaphysics that being is not able to be a genus, but rather, because of this, things are said to be added to being insofar as they express a mode of the very being which is not expressed in the name or the word being. This happens in two ways. In one way, as the expressed mode is some special mode of being. For there are diverse grades of being, according to which are accepted diverse modes of being, and adjoining these modes are accepted diverse categories of being, of things. For substance does not add some difference to being, which designates some nature added to being, but rather the word substance expresses a special mode of being, namely being through itself. And it is likewise with the other categories. Now here, Thomas tells us that being per se is the mode of being proper to substance, and that we should not think of this mode of being as something like an external addition, like a difference. He gives these examples, like a difference added to a genus or an accident to a subject. The reason is simple. There simply is nothing external to being to which to be added. Now, given my interpretation in the previous section, it follows that the sense of being that is pertinent to this discussion is essence, because essence is common to all of the categories and is differentiated, so to speak, according to their modes of being, as we saw above in the definition of substance and accident. While Thomas's language of modality seems to be something of a departure from Avicenna and the later commentators' language of completers or constituents, Thomas's position yet shares a striking similarity with Avicenna and the commentators' view. We can see this clearly in an early text from Thomas's commentary on the sentences. This is again our sentences 1, distinction 23. Thomas writes, text 7, "For it is clear that to be is a certain common thing, and does not determine some mode of being. Moreover, to subsist signifies a determinate mode of being, according as, namely, something is a being through itself, not in another, like an accident. Similarly, to subsist is the act of something as that which subsists, or that by which it subsists. Moreover, since to subsist signifies determinate esse, and every determination of being follows the form, which is the end, it stands that something is called subsisting by virtue of the first form, which is in the genus of substance, just as a white thing is white by virtue of whiteness, and an animated thing by virtue of soul. And so Boethius says in the categories that ousiosis, or subsistence, is a form accepting the subsistence from which it subsists. Like Avicenna's being not in a subject as a primary constituent, which follows necessarily upon the essence of a substance, here Thomas tells us that the determinate mode of being, for example, per se, follows upon the substantial form. And thus it is in this way, like the commentators' paracoluthemata. Moreover, the determinate mode of being is something accepted by the form as the subsistence by which the form subsists, and thus it is in this way like the commentators' sumplerogikon, or the constituent property. Now, I must confess that at this point in my research, I've not found the reason why Thomas uses this language of modes rather than that of constituent, as we found in Avicenna, and which was common in the commentary tradition. I have some hypotheses. There appear to be several influences on Thomas that led him to think in terms of modes rather than constituents. First, there was the tradition of reading the categories in the Latin West, influenced by Garlandus, to think of the categories as signifying things in diverse ways or in diverse modes. Aside from this historical influence, it strikes me that there's a certain philosophical usefulness in the language of modes over that of constituents. The language of modes avoids the appearance of super-adding something outside of being to being. Further, to call being per se a mode of being emphasizes that this is being per se is not just one of the many properties that follows upon the essence of a thing. Rather, being per se or being not in a subject is the condition of the essence when it actually exists in an instance. So in short, the mode of being is the how it is, when or if it is. And this is kind of useful. This is clearer for Thomas, I think, because it avoids the sense that we saw him worry about in the De Veritate, that we're adding kind of a differentia to a genus. This could be, Aquinas has good reason to worry about this, because in the commentary tradition, being not in a subject is treated kind of like a differentia. The term sumplerodicon is reserved in the commentary tradition for this phrase being per se and for differentia, which is well known and discussed in the literature on Plotinus. All right, so let's get down to this third doctrine. The third doctrine that Thomas learns from Avicenna is that there are two senses of being that pertain to this phrase, being not in a subject, or being per se. Now, as we have seen, objects in the categories are certain essences which have a certain property of or mode of being that belongs to them essentially. Being through itself pertains essentially to substances, and being in another pertains essentially to accidents. These properties are constitutive of and follow from the essence of the thing, and describe how the substance exists, if or when it exists. But an ambiguity is going to trouble this account. It seems plausible to take the being in the phrase being not in a subject to signify existence. After all, this seems supported in Aristotle, because Aristotle tells us that without a substance, quote, it is not possible for a single one of the other things to be. This sounds existential. But if the being in the phrase being not in a subject pertains essentially to substance and follows necessarily from the essence of a substance, does it follow that every substance must necessarily actually exist? This was a problem that Avicenna was clearly aware of, and he was eager to disambiguate this phrase, being not in a subject. We find him doing so in a number of texts, but the text I'm going to focus on is the one that Thomas had access to by way of Al-Ghazali, as David Twetton in recent years has argued persuasively, I think. So this is text 8 on your handout. A substance is that whose essence does not exist in a subject when the substance exists. Furthermore, it is that which can be realized only in a subject matter. From this point of view, there is no doubt that a body is a substance, though one can doubt the actual existence of that body, which is a substance, until one knows whether or not it is in a subject. Hence, substance is that which has an essence, such as materiality, spirituality, humanity, and hoarseness. The condition of such an essence specifies that one does not know whether or not it has existence until its existence is realized in a subject. Whatever is of such a nature possesses an essence other than existence. Consequently, whatever has no essence other than existence is not a substance. The necessary existent is, therefore, not a substance. In brief, it is not in any category because existence is external to essence for each category, and hence it would only be in accidental addition to the essence of the necessary existent if the necessary existent belonged to a category. Here, Avicenna makes explicit that to be in a category requires that one's essence and one's existence be distinct. Moreover, we see the familiar point that a substance is an essence for which to be is to be not in a subject. But notice Avicenna's puzzling claim that one might be ignorant of the actual existence of the substance until one knows that the substance is in a subject. Clearly, Avicenna cannot mean that the substance is in a subject like an accident is in a subject. Rather, Avicenna seems to have in mind that substances are in subjects in the sense that the essence of the substance is instantiated in an individual. It is only when we come into contact with an actual instance of the substance, for example, Owen or Richard, that we know that there is such a thing as human. So what is Avicenna up to in this text? It's kind of a puzzling, strange text. Well, in another text, this one quite unknown to Thomas directly, Avicenna is very clear. This is text 9 in your handout. Perhaps one thinks that the meaning of the being not in a subject extends to the first and to everything else as a genus, so that he falls into the genus of substance. But this is an error. For by the being not in a subject, which is like a description of substance, is not meant a being in an active being, not in a subject, such that from the knowledge that Zaid is in himself substance, one knows that he is a being in act. Absolutely not. Or moreover, about the state of that being. But the meaning which applies to substance as a description and in which a specific substance participates according to its potency, as one participates in a genus, it is that it is an essence and reality whose being is only not in a subject. And this description pertains to, for example, Zaid and Amr, according to their essence, and not by a cause. And concerning the being in act, which is a part of the phrase, a being in an act, not in a subject, this is had by virtue of a cause, which is a part of its being, a being in act, not in a subject, and thus it belongs to it by a cause. Now in this text, Avicenna clarifies that being not in a subject does not mean actually being not in a subject, such that from the knowledge that X is a substance, one could infer that there is an instance of X existing here and now. Though Thomas would not have known about this above text, he would have known as much from the Latin translation of Al-Ghazali's Maqasid al-Falasifa. And this is text 10 in our handout. Al-Ghazali writes, just as nothing suits substance, other than that it is a thing to which to be is not to be in a subject, namely, when it had been, when it existed, it is not in a subject, not that it would have been a being in actuality by itself. An example of this case for you is the animal which is called phoenix, which is without a doubt a substance, although you can doubt if it is now, if it exists now or not, and likewise in the case of many other substances. Therefore, substance is called the certitude of the thing, and that which is itself, since being an act occurs to it, and is not in its species. So substance is the rendering of a thing for whom being is diverse from what it itself is. So it follows from this fact that the necessary being does not fall into the 10 categories. For because it does not fall into the because it does not fall into the category of substance, then much less does it fall into the accidental categories, especially since being is beyond the essence of all the categories. We see in this text from Al-Ghazali the same insistence that being not in a subject pertains to a substance when that substance actually exists. There thus seems to be two important senses in which being not in a subject might be said of a substance. On the one hand, being not in a subject is like a property of substance which follows necessarily and essentially. A substance is a being not in a subject by virtue of itself. On the other hand, being not in a subject in the sense of actually existing now, not in a subject, is said of a substance not by virtue of itself, but by virtue of some other cause. This argument found in Avicenna and transmitted through Al-Ghazali is the clear source for the reasoning we find in Thomas's genus argument and his intellectus essentiae argument, as Twetten has shown. We find the doctrine clearly here in the sentences commentary. This is text 11 in your handout. Thomas writes, everything that is in a genus has an essence differing from its being, for example, a human. For being in act, actual existence, is not owed to humanity on account of the fact that it is human. For humanity is able to be thought, and yet one is able to be ignorant of whether someone is a human. And the reason for this is because a common thing, which is predicated of these things, which are in a category, predicates the essence, since genus and species are predicated in an essential manner. Moreover, these essences are not owed being unless on account of the fact that they are received in this or that. And so the essence of a genus or species is not made common according to one existence for all, but only according to one common notion, ratio. Hence it stands that its existence is not its essence. Here Thomas follows Avicenna in arguing that everything in a genus has an essence distinct from its existence. The reason is that the essence or common nature, which is that by virtue of which something is in the category of substance, is not owed actuality until it is, quote, received in this or that. In other words, until it is completed by a determinate mode of being and instantiated in an instance. We can see this in the example Aquinas uses. Humanity in and of itself is not a complete determinate being because it is only the formal part of a human. But an actual human, a human actually existing, whom you might greet at the store or whom you might praise for their Averroes scholarship, is more than just the common nature signified by the term humanity. The act of being a human entails that the essence humanity enters into composition with things outside of the essence to constitute a human being. It is for this reason that Aquinas says that to be in act, that is, actually existent, is something which is owed to humanity by virtue of itself, but accomplished only when it is received in a supposit. Aquinas' point does not seem to be that you must posit a unique actus essendi in order to explain how things are individuated. Rather, the point seems to be the other way around. The unique actus essendi for a human being is the result of the determination and completion or perfection of an essence by its acquiring a determinate mode of being for which it is suited. All right, so let's take stock of what we've discussed and reach our conclusions. So what are the takeaways? What are we supposed to learn from these major doctrines? I think we should note these few things. First of all, knowing the source of this argument, the one we just discussed in Aquinas, we can with confidence gloss Thomas's use of the word genus as category. As both Avicenna and Al-Ghazali claim that essence and existence are distinct in every category. Thus, Aquinas' genus argument here does not concern a logical distinction between essence and existence, nor does it move duplicitously from a logical distinction to a real distinction, as has been claimed, for example, by John Whipple. By talking about the categories, Aquinas makes it clear that he's not here concerned with the ratio in the sense of a universal concept in the mind that ranges over many instances. Rather, the context and source of the argument makes clear that Aquinas has in mind a distinction between the essence, that is, the form of the part, by virtue of which a thing is in a category, that is, ens perfectum, so distinguishing that from its actuality. This argument does not begin in the realm of concepts, and at no point does it move to the realm of concepts. The categories, that into which extramental ens perfectum is sorted, categorize extramental essence. This is the context for the argument. Now, I do not claim to make any determination here about what kind of argument this genus argument is. This is a big dispute in the literature. I'm not going to make any determinations whether this genus argument is a demonstrative argument or a dialectical argument, as Hauser has recently argued. Rather, all I have intended to do here is to articulate some of the background assumptions and doctrine that go into a proof of the real distinction, like the genus argument, whatever kind of argument it is. Our second conclusion, we should take away the fact that Aquinas learned from Avicenna to think of the categories as categorizing essences which are of themselves composite and thus incomplete. Though being not in a subject is an essential fact about substance and pertains to it by virtue of itself, actually existing through oneself not in a subject is not something that pertains to the essence in the category of substance by virtue of itself. This message is as old as the commentators, who viewed Aristotle's categories as pertaining exclusively to composite, terrestrial, and thus imperfect substances. And Avicenna, though perhaps not the only source, is an important avenue by which this message reaches Thomas in the 13th century. We thus have here two senses of the phrase being not in a subject. as being not in a subject is a mode of being, and a mode of being is how the essence is when it is, we have one sense of being not in a subject that emphasizes the how, and another that emphasizes the when or the if. As the how the essence is, being not in a subject is an essential and constitutive fact about substances. As the when or the if the essence is, being not in a subject is something that does not pertain to an essence by virtue of itself, but rather is an external determination of the essence, resulting in a complete being. That these two senses can be expressed comfortably in the language of modes is, in my view, the reason why Thomas's language of modes rather than constituent is a more philosophically expedient option, while also capturing the same relation as the language of constituent, namely that being not in a subject is a determination of an essence which necessarily follows upon that essence and enters into composition with the essence. It's like a property. It's like an added thing. Third, this reading of the categories and the complex structure of the categories is not without justification in the very text of Aristotle. As we saw above, the motivation for saying that the categories categorize essence seems to arise primarily out of Aristotle's lumping all of the categories under the division of per se, kathauto being. Moreover, Aristotle emphasizes shortly after this text that being in the sense of act and potency divides even the category of substance, such that there are potential and actual substances. Avicenna's insight, carried on into Aquinas, is, in my view, based on recognizing that this division of even the category of substance by act and potency necessitates that being in the sense of act, which I take to be equivalent to our term existence, is something that does not necessarily pertain to a substance. For in order for X to be a substance, if in order for X to be a substance, it is requisite that X be an actual substance, then Aristotle is wrong in speaking about potential substances. All right, fourth and finally, we should take away from these doctrines that contemplating the structure of the categories, the essences, modi essendi, and the acti essendi, and the definition of substance provides for Aquinas the occasion on which to discover the real distinction between essence and existence in the categories. Gilson's claim that the essence-existence distinction is the key to understanding Thomas's Avicennian definition of substance is correct in one sense. At the level of principles, indeed, the real distinction is the key to Thomas's Avicennian definition. But at the level of discovery, it is my conviction that the Avicennian definition of substance provides the occasion for discovering the real distinction. Thus, the real distinction of essence and existence in the categories is the result of a tradition of reading Aristotle's categories. The real distinction between essence and existence is not merely a theologically motivated tool to help distinguish creator from the created, or the result of Mutazili Quranic commentary, though, of course, each of these play their role in this story. Rather, as Robert Wisnowski has shown with respect to Avicenna's view of the soul, so too is Avicenna's real distinction between essence and existence the result of a prolonged engagement with the late antique Neoplatonic commentators, notably the Ammonian Alexandrian school of commentary. This is a tradition that Aquinas inherited and carried on by way of Avicenna. And insofar as ens commune is the subject of metaphysics, and as a recent study by Gavin Carr has demonstrated, ens commune is that sense of being which is common to the categories, I think it's fair to say that for Thomas Aquinas, ens commune signifies essence, which is to be found in all of the categories, determined according to its appropriate mode, and completed in its actus essendi. This entails that, for our Thomas Aquinas, the influence of Avicenna on his reading of the categories, and the senses of being which are common to, distinguish, and complete the categories, constitutes a thoroughly Avicennian understanding of the science of metaphysics, and thus rests at the very heart of Thomas's metaphysics. Thomas is certainly not reoccupying the position of Aristotle when he considers substance. In fact, He takes the opportunity of contemplating the internal structure of the category of substance to discover there the real distinction between essence and existence. Everyone, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. And we have a small enough group that I think that you can be invited to take your own questions. So we do have a hand raise function, much as there is in Zoom. If you go to at the top level there, you can see a third icon from the left. There's a number of you see a little fellow or woman there with a hand raised, and you can have your mouse hover over that and get the hand raise feature, and we can take questions that way.
I think Paul is first. Yeah, Paul.
Nice. Hi, Nathaniel. Thanks for your awesome presentation. I'm going to keep my camera down because I'm nursing a cold and I'm not quite presentable. But in any case, towards the end, you started talking about the motivations for Avicenna to stress this distinction between essence and existence. I was wondering if you could talk about Aquinas's motivations for doing that, because I think that's in this discussion, as of where I am now, that's where I think most comfortable in considering where he applies the distinction, obviously in his third way and in the Contra Gentiles when he develops it. So I'm wondering what the reason he develops it, the kind of work that it's going to do for him, and maybe also where it stands with respect to his greater work, what he's done before finding that distinction and what it allows him to do afterwards. You can choose any one of those strands and develop it as you like.
Paul, thank you so much, and I hope you feel better soon. Well, yeah, this is a big question. This is a challenging question. I think the motivation for the real distinction always comes down to the fact that we need some way to distinguish the simple first principle from the complex things that it creates. Now, what I want to emphasize when it's presented that way, this sounds like a theological doctrine. Like, well, I need to posit the real distinction in order to explain how creator and creatures are going to be different. And certainly I think that is a strong motivation here. But we kind of miss the story of how this is developing from the philosophical literature that Avicenna and Aquinas are engaging. So this is why I want to emphasize that we see in the Neoplatonic commentators the distinction between the simple first principle and its complex I don't want to say creatures, emanations, things that it made, is kind of at the forefront here, and that this kind of turns into an entire reading, an entire system for reading the categories. So the motivation, I think, for Thomas is kind of twofold. You know, on the one hand, to distinguish the first principle, the simple first principle, from its complex creatures, but also to kind of adopt this way of making sense of the categories, to understand all of the categories as comprising essences that are complex and imperfect. As far as what this allows Thomas to do, kind of moving forward and moving further, what I kind of gestured at the end of the paper, but don't have the time here to develop, this really allows Thomas's view of metaphysics to start to take shape. Kind of what does metaphysics study? Because of course, metaphysics reaches up to the first principle as the cause of its subject matter, but God is not the subject matter of metaphysics properly. And so when we ask what is the subject matter of metaphysics, Thomas will tell us frequently it's ens commune. And this is going to be a sense of being that is common to the categories. So we see kind of Thomas reflecting this reading of the categories as oh no, can you still hear me? Oh, I think you might have lost me for just a second.
We lost the last couple of sentences, I think.
Oh, okay. Well, so Paul, I guess let me. This is fortuitous. I was getting cut off because I was going too long. This allows Thomas to really fully develop his understanding of the scientific profile, and the subject matter of metaphysics. Paul, does that answer your question well?
That's wonderful, and it's definitely a bunch of great jumping off points for future research. Thank you very much.
Thank you kindly. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think Mariamne is next.
Hi. I see that you're not working in a theological register, but I want to ask a kind of theological question, I'm afraid.
I'll do my best.
Well, I was just wondering if, I mean, you talk about this distinction between, being of first principle and everything else. I mean, for Aquinas, he's specifically dealing with the Trinitarian context, and I wonder if he talks about being within God in that sense, because you were talking about this phrase of modes of being, which immediately makes me think of like the Cappadocian Fathers, the patristic Byzantine background. They speak of modes of being in the Godhead, like tropos paxios, and that's the kind of modes of being language where you have being shared between three modes of existence. And I don't know if that enters into it at all, or what you think about that. Thank you.
Mariamne, thank you so much. It certainly enters into it, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to confess a great deal of difficulty and ignorance. So one of the key texts that I found quite illuminating. It's become something of a global text for me. Is that Sentences Commentary text, Book 1, Distinction 23, because that is a text where Thomas is talking about the Trinity. He's commenting on the differences between the Greek language for talking about the persons of the Trinity, hypostasis, and how that language differs in the Latin context, subsistentia. Now, I am not quite sure if I can fully connect how these concepts can be intelligibly applied to beings in the categories and the divine being. This has been something that's kind of puzzled me reading the text the whole time, because for a text that is its goal is to illuminate the use of this language in Trinitarian context, Thomas is strangely talking about being in the categories there. So you'll have to help me, because I'm quite mystified. I'm not quite sure what to do with that text. There seems to be certainly ways in which this language can be used in analogous fashions of the Godhead, but it's challenging for me to see quite what Thomas is up to. Mariamne, I'm sorry, that's not quite a great answer.
We'll have to discuss it more at some point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Joseph Novak, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm afraid my questions might not be very, very good. I didn't find access to your citations, so I'm more familiar with Zoom and anyway. But two things. When one's talking about the Aristotelian background, Aristotle does talk about these four methodological questions that one uses when one's engaged in, and of course the first one, does it exist?
Yes.
You're object exists. And then he says, what is it? And then he goes on, what are its properties and why does it have those properties? So I'm wondering, is there any sense in which that's coming in as a distinction for the essence, existence, a distinction? And then the second thing, when one talks about, if one were to talk about the essences of categories, of the individual categories, that's basically, is to say that what is their TSD, what's the quiddity or the quid est, of the thing. So when one does, I mean, you did present the case, and it's very intelligible that categories, each of the categories, you can speak of it as whiteness as having an essence, But of course, it's in a sense an essence that ultimately has to be grounded in something, right? It's not going to be of an equal status as the essence of a man or a horse or something like that, right? So because there will implicitly, if you push the definition far enough, it's going to be reverting to some kind of subject, right? So just if you could say something about that, yeah. And I'm very sorry I didn't have if you can send those to me, I'd appreciate it, the texts, so.
Certainly. I think they're up in the meeting chat now.
Yeah, if you go to the second to the left of the icons, that's the conversation, and then I gave a link to my personal Google Drive where you can access and download the document.
Yeah, it's not working. Anyway, go ahead.
I can certainly email it to you, Joseph. Thank you so much. Yes, so I'll address the 2 points in order. So you're certainly correct that the 4 methodological questions that we ask at the beginning of a science are relevant here. I didn't address any texts where Thomas or Avicenna bring this up, but I think certainly in the text, for example, the Al-Isharat text from Avicenna and the Danishnama text, we certainly see Avicenna here kind of thinking about the is it question. As we're beginning an investigation into something, we're looking to see if there's an instance of the essence, and that seems to be certainly how the Arabic philosophers read the is it question. We see this especially in Stephen Menn's research on Al-Farabi, that to answer the is it question is to find an instance that matches a description of the thing. This, I think, we see Avicenna doing in those texts. Now, Thomas affirms very strongly that these methodological questions are relevant to the discussion of the distinction between essence and existence. In his Quodlibetal Questions 221, Aquinas says that there's a direct parallel between the real distinction between a thing's essence and its existence and the questions, what is it and is it? And that the what is it asks after the thing's essence, and the is it, the does it exist, asks after the thing's actuality, its existence. There's good reason to think that Aquinas is following Avicenna on this point for 2 reasons. First of all, the source of that Quodlibetal Questions 221 is a text from Al-Ghazali. And it's Al-Ghazali's Maqasid al-Falasifa, that text that I cited in this presentation, where Al-Ghazali is kind of summarizing in Avicennian metaphysics. So that language of drawing a parallel between the 2 questions and the real distinction, Aquinas seems to get from Al-Ghazali. But in Quodlibetal Questions 221, there's this added difficulty that Aquinas says actuality, existence is accidental to an essence. And this is, of course, Thomists are going to have a big problem with this, because doesn't Aquinas, throw Avicenna under the bus for precisely this doctrine that existence is accidental to an essence? And well, I always want to emphasize, well, it depends on what we mean by accidental, and Aquinas is happy to recognize a sense in which existence is accidental to essence. And now your second question, Joseph. Oh yes, concerning essence in the accidental categories. You're entirely correct. I hope I didn't come off as a Scotist in this presentation, giving a univocal sense of being to all the categories. Certainly, in metaphysics, it's Zeta 4. Aristotle writes that essence is said of all the categories, but not univocally. And for precisely the reasoning you gave there, Joseph. Yes, there is some determinant. What is it? There is some determinate essence in the accidental categories. There's a determinant what it is to be white. And to give an account of what it is to be white, we're going to include the fact that, well, the condition of its existence is that it's found in substances. You won't meet it walking along the street. You'll find it in those substances. And so what I think is kind of difficult about that text, we especially have a hard time when Aristotle tells us that a term is said homonymously. We have a hard time recognizing, we want to say, especially contemporary scholars, Joseph Owens commits this all the time. Owens wants to say that because the essence of accidents includes substance, that at the end of the day, essence doesn't pertain to accidents. It reduces down to the essence of the accidents. And I think that this kind of reductive picture is incorrect. And I think that we see this in the commentators kind of really worrying about reducing the essence of an accident to its substance. So certainly, essence is not said univocally of all of the categories. It's said primarily of substance and then secondarily, posteriorly of the accidents. But I wouldn't want to say because of that essence isn't said at all of accidents. I think the commentators kind of bring this out nicely for us. No, it is said of it. There are natures there which include the substance. Joseph, does that answer your two questions well?
Yeah, no, very good. I mean, the paper was terrific. It's all kinds of questions one could raise, I suppose. I guess in the case of something like accidents, you don't want to set up a picture where each accident has its own active essay, so to speak, which would then pile on to the substance, and it's, it would get to be a very complicated picture, I suppose.
Certainly. And in fact, this is Calvin Normore has argued that this is one of the reasons that Descartes is just going to throw out accidents and adopt a metaphysics of substances and modes. Because if accidents have their own essences and there's this kind of extra act that's just adding on to substances, and it becomes a complex account very, very quickly, especially when we see the Eucharist, the Blessed Sacrament.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. I don't know who is next, either Dr. Golden or Dr. Taylor.
I think it's from vertical, from top down is the order of in which hands are raised. I believe it's Dr. Taylor.
Okay. Oh, excellent. Okay. Dr. Taylor, please.
Hey, well, let's. Can you hear me well enough, Nathaniel?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I'm interested in differences between Aquinas and Avicenna, as opposed to similarities and quite a distance. So for Aquinas, Dionysus is extremely important. He cites him many, many times. And following the proclamations of William of Auvergne, 41, Aquinas and Albert both follow the notion that the what's the phrase now? Deus Revelatus is the proper interpretation of Dionysus. There is no Deus abscondi, absolutely abscondi. Where tradition, Greek Orthodox tradition, Dionysus has the Deus, the Deus transcends. And so Aquinas, it draws on Dionysus. He uses that to interpret some of Dionysus as well, and follows the line with Dionysus that all being is pre-contained in the Deus Revelatus and flows forth from the Deus Revelatus. And it has forms and creatures and everything else, but it can all be reduced back to the simplicity of one simple essence, which is the divine essence of the Deus Revelatus. Well, Avicenna is also influenced by Dionysus, I believe, as well, or at least certainly by the Greek Syriac tradition in this, because Avicenna is reading the Arabic Plotinus, and that Arabic Plotinus was translated by Abdul Masih ibn Naima, Syriac Christians, and much of the material is available through Syriac Christians. But the Syriac Christians, by the 9th century, they had absorbed an awful lot of Greek thought, and theological and philosophical, and there are monasteries dotted here and there, which have some quite significant influence. Plus, they're the translators. Hunayn ibn Ishaq is a Syrian Christian. He's translating Greek into Syriac. His son certainly is translating Greek and Syriac into Arabic. And so there's quite an emphasis there. So for Avicenna, then it's the first name for God is not God, because that makes reference to creatures, and there is no essential reference in God to creatures, lest God be compelled to make creatures in some fashion. So the proper naming of God is an issue. Avicenna's argument leads to the wajib al-wujud, the necessity essay at the top, that cannot be named. And transcend names. Aquinas, though, confronts this, as you know, in the commentary on the sentences, and says, in my interpretation, says, Maimonides is obviously in the same camp with Avicenna. Right. So Avicenna seems to hold that it's both ontologically impossible or metaphysically impossible and epistemologically impossible to name God. Just two translations to it. And there's a short article about this Quranic interpretation by Avicenna, an article by Sebti and Desmet. I think you've seen that. And so it seems that Avicenna, Aquinas, the commentary in the sentences, Maimonides, you got your view from Avicenna. Except that Maimonides has it epistemologically not possible for us. God does have an essence, but we just can't know it. We're not up to it. And Aquinas flips it all and says, you're both wrong. We can know the divine essence in a way, and you're both completely wrong. Now, you slipped in the word, or it fell into the discussion. And simplicity is extraordinarily important because, of course, for Aquinas, God, the only thing is identical with his powers completely. And so you found an important point of coincidence with Avicenna and Aquinas. Why do they go in such different ways on the nature of being? I'll give you some.
It's a very good question. It's a very challenging question. There are, this has been an issue that's been plaguing my research. I think, as you know, Dr. Taylor, because I am not sure what to make of the Avicenna that Aquinas reads. Who this Avicenna is and what he believed. Because of course you have that text early in the sentences where Thomas is lumping Avicenna with together with Maimonides, and he's saying, you know, it's not quite right, but Aquinas is also saying it is right. You know, it's not inconsistent with the opinions of Dionysius and Anselm. So there's something to it, and in fact, in one of the texts where Aquinas is talking about the definition of substance, whether it applies to God, Aquinas says, you know, he takes the Avicennian route and he says, no, it doesn't. It doesn't apply because then God would be in a genus. But also it kind of does. And the Aquinas' source for saying this, I think, is, again, Al-Ghazali. Because we saw in that text, or actually, I don't believe we saw it in that text. The text that I cited in this presentation, Al-Ghazali mentions, in one sense, God could be called a substance exclusively in the sense that being not in a subject is a negation, and we can predicate negations of God. And so in that sense alone, we can call God a substance. And this is exactly what Aquinas ends up saying in his Sentences commentary. Albert as well. Albert also says this in his Sentences commentary. So that being the case, Albert and Aquinas are getting this language from Al-Ghazali, Al-Ghazel, you know, in their translation, who they would have thought of as a student of Avicenna. So they would have thought of perhaps Avicenna as, yeah, being happy to give negative predicates, negative predication of God. We can say at least that. So there's something kind of interesting going on in how to make sense of Aquinas' own his reading of Avicenna, who Avicenna is. But as to where they really go different, where they go differently about being, I think as you mentioned, the Dionysian background here for Aquinas is hugely important, and he does seem to distinguish that from the Avicennian tradition, in the sense that the first being, God, is the kind of fullness of the perfections of being, pre-contains it all in a transcendently simple way. I don't know if I've quite seen that presentation of being in Avicenna. I mean, this gets us back to the necessary being, and why does Aquinas not use necessity, or you use the language of necessary being when it comes to God? Of that question, I take maybe a controversial stance here. I think that Aquinas thinks he's being more Avicennian than he seems, because at the beginning of the Metaphysics of the Healing, Avicenna says that to treat of necessity and contingency is the same thing as to treat of act and potency. And so I think perhaps Aquinas, motivated by his teacher Albert to make Aristotle more intelligible to the Latins, takes the language of pure act, more Aristotelian language than the language of necesse esse. But that's simply a hypothesis.
Well, that was an easy question, but let me throw in another wrench in here for you to ponder, and that is the commentary on the Periharmonies, first part and 14th discussion, and that is where God is above necessity and possibility. Have you thought about that?
No, I'm afraid I haven't. But that's very good. Thank you. Let me take that down to consider.
It's Lexio 14. Well, I'll stop now. That's quite enough. We've gone to the depths of being, or transcendence of being. So, Owen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. After such heady and important and deep questions, I have a very small point to ask. And let me, especially since not all of us have the text, let me project the So can we all see this? My question has to do with the Ghazal al-Ghazal text here, and this particular line here where he's dealing with the status of substance and the status of phoenix as a substance. And our translation has, therefore, substance is called the certitude of the thing. And the Latin here is substantia igitur est interpretatio rei. What's the sense of interpretatio here? I mean, what exactly, this bears on very, very big issues, namely what exactly is the ontological status of non-existent essences. But I'm just wondering what's going on with the Latin here, and because certitude is kind of an epistemological term, at least as I understand it, and I don't think that's what's going on here. So I was wondering if you could just clarify that small point.
Absolutely, yeah. Owen, thank you so much. So just to clarify, so the certitude of the thing actually is up earlier.
Oh, okay. Okay, certitude is here. I see.
Certitude,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But thank you for this question, because this is an important question.
But here he's still saying it's still an epistemological term. So pardon my confusion with the Latin, but I'm still not sure what it means to talk about substance as certitude.
Yes. So what's going on in the Latin here is that certitudo is the Latin word that was used to translate Avicenna's haqiqa, which means the reality, the truthfulness, and this is a term that Avicenna uses in his in the Metaphysics of the Healing 1.5, where he's talking about the primary concepts that fall first into the intellect: being, thing, and necessity. He gives haqiqa as a synonym for thing. He also gives mahia as a synonym for a thing. So, yeah, this language of certitudo, it is a fairly faithful rendering of the Arabic, but the point you're hitting at, and this kind of strange, this is an epistemic term, I agree with you. There's something strange about it, yes, but this is Avicenna's terminology for essence, and he makes use of it's truth, it's reality. It's sometimes translated, but the word haq is the root there of the term, and in Arabic that is truth. So it is the truth about the thing, the stable truth that makes it to be what it is. Not so much from the context of it's the truth as known, but it's the kind of experimental truth. It's the grounds. It's the foundations.
Okay. So you get kind of, just as in the for what I've noticed in discussions about the Arabic tradition, you get the idea that demonstration conveys certitude, even though that's sort of in the shadow of skeptical debates concerning our epistemological access to objects of scientific understanding. You don't have a concern with certitude as such in Aristotle. That sort of bleeds over then, according to which the essence of a thing, the foundation of explanation, the ontological foundation of the thing, is rendered under epistemological terms. So there's kind of a use of epistemic terms here for the ontological idea. And here the ontological idea. So there is kind of an ontological correlate to the essence of the phoenix, which is going to be what you're seeing in the Arabic tradition, but you're not seeing in the Aristotelian tradition.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I have at times, I'm disputing about this with David Twetton. I like the term truth maker here. I would want to say, for certitudo, for haqiqa, I would want to say the truth maker, to really emphasize that it's that ontological correlate and not the epistemic. Interestingly enough, Avicenna also uses a kind of epistemic term for existence in the same chapter, muthabita, if I remember correctly, which is like the affirmation. Existence is like an affirmation. But yeah, so this was just kind of this was a common feature in Avicenna.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Can I follow up on that just a little bit? I wanted to follow up asking Joseph a question though. Joseph, is physis rendered hakika in the physics? I just don't recall.
Ooh.
Hakika, reality.
Yes.
It's
Right.
the reality.
Is
Yes.
that the Arabic rendering of physis in the physics?
No. It's I don't think so. No. Hakika, it's used in many occasions, and the rendering is the truth means the reality. So it's
Well, why don't we carry on? And I'm going to go look it up. so check so, okay, thanks.
I think it appears here in the text, in the handout. I think Makulat, the 5, Al-Makulat, I think it appears, no? Appears Mahia, and then it says the first constituent, well, the primary, you translated, the primary constituent of li haqiqatihi, of its, you translated by essence, of its reality, no? If it's, this is our, Kamal, I think it's wrong. The Arabic text, the Arabic edition doesn't say Kamala, it says Kama. And so كما تعلموا أنه جوهر ولا تعلموا أنه هل هو موجود في أجيال بالفيل وفي موضوع. So you translated it here by essence. Mukawam is correct. Mukawam, you know, we have this root, this kama, to stand up, and kawama, to be a constituent of something, to be the element of something, and then also when it comes to subsist, you were seeing subsist to subsist. Usually, it's the yatakawam. It's the other form, no? And qiyam, also the meaning, the master qiyam, to have subsistence. But here, yes, it's right. It's muqawim is the constituent, and haqiqa, it's true reality. It's so. But in the physics now, you ask me what is in the physics, and I cannot remember now. I'm not able to answer you what is in the physics haqiqa. I think it's the meaning of, well, in general, reality, the real thing, al-haq, no? And usually for God is al-haq, no? I mean, it's
Thank you, Joseph. I confess that I have someone. This is my home office. Someone is coming at 3, so I'm not going to be able to sustain the meeting much longer. But I see that Joseph, not Joseph, but Joseph has one more question.
Just a quick add on the thank you. Just a quick add on to the certitude thing, because it struck me too when you read your paper. It was bizarre, but then I thought, you know, in Paul's letter to the Hebrews, or whoever the author of the Hebrews is, the famous definition of faith is the hypostasis of things hoped for, and that oftentimes gets translated as certitude or assurance of things hoped for. So there's that crossover between the ontological and the epistemological there, I think, precisely because, as was already pointed out, you get this confluence of what's real and what's true. And so it's, anyway, thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Joseph. Yeah. Owen, we can't hear you.
This has been wonderful. Your progress is truly impressive on the dissertation. I look forward to even better things in the months to come. Thank you for sharing this with us. And if anybody needs to have more dialogue with Nathaniel, or to request the handout, you can see his name there, nathaniel.taylor@marquette.edu. So let's all give a round of applause to Nathaniel and our thanks.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for the conversation, the logos. This was a great time. Thank you so much.
Everybody have a nice afternoon. Those of us at Marquette, happy grading.
Very well. Thanks again.
Okay. Ciao.